The Cold War began when the alliance between the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union fell apart after the surrender of Nazi Germany after the Allied powers' victory in World War II. The Soviets had a cocky ego for their contribution to the victory of the war and had the desire to spread their governmental practices throughout Eastern Europe at a rapid rate. This sparked concern to the United States that they had to do something to prevent Soviet ideologies from spreading to the democracies of Western Europe. In 1946, the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill delivered his Iron Curtain speech, which marked the beginning of the Cold War era. Churchill's speech highlights the political divide in Europe, signifying the need for Western unity to protect against communist spread. He claims, "From what I have seen of our Russian friends and allies during the war, I am convinced that there is nothing they desire so much as strength. For that reason, the old doctrine of balance of power is unsound. If the Western democracies stand together in a strict adherence to the principles of the United Nations Charter, their influence for furthering those principles will be immense and no one is likely to molest them." Because of the communist threat, the United States issued the Marshall Plan, one of the first steps in the country's attempt to stop Soviet ideologies. This plan gave aid to Western Europe to rebuild after the war disasters, with the intention to gain those countries' support away from communist influence posed by the Soviet Union. The Cold War was at its peak from 1948 to 1953. The Korean War was the first major war conflict of the era. The United States specifically entered the Korean War because of the country's containment policy, whose goal was to prevent the spread of communism. After North Korea, a communist nation that was supplied and advised by China and the Soviet Union, invaded South Korea, a capitalist nation, war had begun. The United Nations, along with the United States, both supporters of a capitalist government, joined the war with the South Koreans to protect against the communist threat. Over 1 million casualties were suffered on both sides of the war until the tensions ended in July 1953. This war resulted in a long-term division of Korea as they were separated by a border into individual North and South governments with different ideologies. This was an important event of the Cold War because it was an early event that built tensions with the Soviets and China that would soon lead to more conflicts. In October of 1957, the Soviet Union began the space race after the announcement of the first satellite launched into space, known as the Sputnik. It orbited Earth every 90 minutes and sent out signals to radio operators to monitor the data. The United States was shocked and overloaded with jealousy that the Soviets had beat them to space, the unknown world that had not been discovered yet. This event had officially begun a space race between the two superpower countries chasing dominance. In the United States' favor, they began NASA in 1958, a space program which launched its own satellites and specialized in space research. This space competition led to rapid development of space innovations and research between both countries. For example, 12 years after the launch of Sputnik, the United States landed the first man on the moon, known as Apollo 11, which was a goal of the United States to reach before the Soviets became the first to do it. The Bay of Pigs invasion was a failed attempt to take over the Cuban government led by Cuban dictator Fidel Castro in April of 1961. The attack was at the Bay of Pigs, a beach on the southwestern coast where around 1,500 exiles directed by the United States opposed Fidel Castro. Prior to the attack, during the presidency of Dwight D. Eisenhower, a final act of his term was breaking diplomatic ties with Cuba and placing an embargo on most exports to Cuba. Immediately, relations between the United States and Cuba began to deteriorate, and Fidel Castro blamed the U.S. for attempting to overthrow the government for the first time. Now in 1961, planned by the CIA and carried out under President John F. Kennedy, 3 U.S. airplanes, operated by native Cuban exiles, made an attack by dropping bombs on Cuban air bases. 2 days later, the attacks continued, and a landing of exiles attacked the Bay of Pigs beach. The strength of the exiles' invasion didn't compare to the power of Fidel Castro's troops. These troops captured more than 1,000 exiles who were eventually imprisoned. Between 1962 and 1965, all prisoners were returned back to the United States as Castro agreed to release the prisoners in an exchange with the United States for $53 million of food and medicine. This event had much importance during the Cold War because it deepened distrust with Cuba, and tensions with the Soviet Union increased because it pushed Cuba further into being allied with the Soviets. This ultimately led to the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis happened in October 1962. After the Americans' failed invasion at the Bay of Pigs in an attempt to overthrow Fidel Castro and the Cuban government, the Soviet premier reached a secret agreement to prevent future invasion attempts by placing nuclear missiles on Cuban soil. This missile confrontation began when the United States spotted nuclear missiles in Cuba, 90 miles away from the mainland United States. President John F. Kennedy demanded that the missiles be removed and issued a naval quarantine of the United States from Cuba. Secretly, the United States had nuclear missiles in Turkey, and through intelligence gathering, those missiles were also discovered by the Soviet Union. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev agreed to remove those missiles in Cuba as long as the same procedure was followed by the United States and Turkey. This was an important event of the Cold War because it was a dramatic showdown between two of the world's strongest powers and was the closest attempt at a nuclear war. The Vietnam War was a crucial number of years that contributed to the Cold War era. It was another conflict between communists and capitalists. The war spanned 20 years, starting at 1955 and ending in 1975. North Vietnam, the communist threat that was supported by China and the Soviet Union, was fighting against South Vietnam, who was backed up by the United States. Once again, the war was by the domino theory, which feared the spread of communism in South Asia and was the ultimate reason why the United States got involved to fight with South Vietnam. The Tet Offensive was the major turning point in the war because it showed that the war had a far-reaching ending, where a series of surprise attacks by the Viet Cong and North forces targeted major cities and bases in South Territory. This specifically impacted the opinion of American citizens because it exposed what the government was lying about versus what was actually happening in reality. A year after, President Richard Nixon began his policy of Vietnamization, which pulled American troops away from the Vietnamese grounds to ultimately leave the South Vietnamese fighting for themselves. The war, ending in 1975, was won by the North after they captured the capital of South Vietnam, leading to the fall of the South to communist rule. This event was important in the Cold War because it shows the struggle to protect against communism, which was the unspoken goal of the Cold War. In 1989, the end of the Cold War was culminated in the fall of the Berlin Wall. After Nazi Germany fell after World War II, the capital of Germany, Berlin, was divided into four parts. France, Great Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union all gained territory of Berlin. The US, France, and Britain ruled all together under West Germany, and the Soviets ruled in East Germany, being physically divided by a concrete wall. The conflict that emerged was that both sectors were ruled under different governments, and both superpowers, the United States and the USSR, were in a race to spread their ideologies, creating a major division in Germany. This weakened the Eastern government, which eventually led to the unity of Germany once again in history. Therefore, the fall of the wall shows that the Cold War officially ended because it symbolizes the collapse of Soviet influence in Eastern Europe, signifying that communism was slowly declining.